So what is the definition of a hidden gem? If it's a comic book that was really good and most people don't know about it or they forgot it existed, and that if it had actually been successful, that it would have made a major change in the industry and would have really inspired a new way of telling stories, then I've got one for you. It is called El Diablo from DC Comics. This was a series that began in 1989. It lasted for 16 issues, and it's some really surprisingly good stuff. And so let me go into why I picked this up. So I remember seeing this cover back in the day as probably an ad or a solicitation or something. So it really stuck with me. And so the first reason for that is the artwork. This is by Mike Parobic. And if you have heard of Mike Parobic, it is probably because you are familiar with his work on Batman Adventures. This was the comic series that DC put out based on Batman the Animated Series, and Mike took over on issue 7. And if you ever want to hunt this down, it came polybagged, so it might look like this. It came with a trading card. Mike Parobic would go on during his run to do the movie adaptation of Batman Mask of the Phantasm, and he would also have the honor of doing the first comic book appearance of Harley Quinn. But I was familiar with his work before then because he was the regular artist and cover artist on The Fly from Impact Comics, and he did incredible work on that series. Unfortunately, it's unlike El Diablo, and the next series I'm about to show you is not in trade paperback or digital, so you have to hunt down the individual issues, but they certainly are worth picking up. And was also the artist of Justice Society of America in the early 90s. He worked on the mini-series, and then he would work on the ongoing series, and that's what I'm showing you because he was also the cover artist on this. And he just had a really great, very distinctive art style I loved to death. And unfortunately, the ongoing series, which was only lasted 10 issues, is not in trade paperback or digital either. And so clearly the visuals stuck with me for this cover. You know, that great costume, the great energy behind this drawing. But also the fact that he is a city council member stuck with me because I'd never heard of a hero being on the city council. So that stuck with me. Also, the fact that he was a minority hero, I mean, a lot of them at the time were former criminals or something like that. And so here's a Hispanic hero who's an elected official. It was very distinctive. And so when I saw Suicide Squad, you know, and El Diablo was this tatted up gang member with satanic powers and stuff, I was like, what the hell is this? You know, El Diablo's not the wet dream of Lou Dobbs. He's a city council member. How could they do that to him? Well, sort of. This is actually not the first version of El Diablo. He actually started out as a white cowboy. This is the second reimagining of the character where they bring him back is a different character who is a superhero. Well, calling him a superhero may be a bit of a stretch. So the original concept for this series was conceived by Brian Augustine. He wanted to do a story with a Hispanic city council member who becomes a vigilante in a smaller town in Texas. And the twist here is that he's just a normal guy who puts on a mask. This is not a superhero story. There are no other people who put on masks with the exception of one retired vigilante who shows up later. We'll talk about that. There's no superpowers. There's no fantastic elements. There's no supervillains. It's just about a normal guy who decides to put on a mask and what would happen. And so that is very different. We've done, you know, what would happen if a normal Joe tried to become a hero over and over again. Like, for instance, another Hispanic hero who also had a background in boxing, Jose Delgado, the gangbuster, you know, had the same premise, but he was in the Superman titles, and so he was facing robots and cyborgs and all this stuff. This is basically asking in the real world, what would happen if you put on that mask? So this is not a superhero comic. This is a drama about a guy in a mask. And it's just very, very different. And so Mike Parabik's first work was in Secret Origins 37. He did a story that ran in that issue. And then this was the very next thing that DC gave him. This was his first full issue and his first series. And I would have never expected them to put somebody with this art style on a drama book. This is a book about real life and real characters. And, you know, Mike Parabik is known for his kinetic action and fun cartoonish style. But I got to tell you, he just knocks it out of the ballpark. This is a book that has a ton of characters in it. And they're basically just standing around talking most of the time. But you can see how great he does the backgrounds. He makes each of these characters extremely distinctive looking. And that's very hard to do when all you have is just these real, you know, world people with this very grounded look about them. And it's just a very impressive work. But of course there are fight scenes in here, and when that happens, of course, it is done with his usual flair for action that is just really wonderful. So obviously the artwork is good, but what about the story? If you're familiar with late 80s, early 90s comics, you're probably like, oh God, this is probably going to be the driest, most boring series ever. Writers back then just didn't do a very good job writing human beings, writing real-world scenarios, writing drama. And you're not that far off on this first issue. This first issue is as dry as you would think it would be. But as the plot line progressed, you could kind of see some potential there. You could tell the writer had done his research and created a pretty authentic city council. There was a great kinetic fight scene at the beginning of the second issue. And we could see how some of those characters were quirky and interesting, and, you know, kind of the potential of what would happen when they interacted with each other. We brought in some teenagers who form Los Diablos, which is El Diablo's eyes and ears. So for instance, this is Hector, who leads the El Diablos, and his girlfriend Yolanda, who has a serious crush on El Diablo. Meanwhile, El Diablo, in his civilian life as city council member Rafael Sandova, has a will they, won't they thing going on with the mayor's assistant, Virginia, also known as Dixie. But that first plot line is just a warm-up, because once we get to the second one that starts in issue 4, The Storm, my goodness, this book just completely transforms and becomes one of the best comics that was put out at the time. This is a story about a serial killer who kills children. And you may say to yourself, but Todd, like, it would be completely unrealistic for El Diablo to be able to hunt this guy down, because, you know, serial killers tend to elude the authorities for a long, long time, and the authorities put, you know, tons and tons of resources into finding them. And you're absolutely right, because it's not about El Diablo versus a serial killer. It's about exactly what I just talked about, the fact that no one can find the serial killer, and how that affects the community, how the deaths of these children divide the community along racial lines, and how it creates tensions between the police and the minority communities in the town. And it's just so authentic and so good and so interesting. I cannot vouch for the Jones's use of Spanish, or, you know, how he does the cultural holidays in the Hispanic community in this book. But what I can tell you is the racial tensions and the tensions between minority communities and the police, and how race is used in politics, etc., are 100% spot on and real, and are still absolutely relevant to this day. And so the third plot line is a two-parter that begins with this wonderful, wonderful cover. And this is a reference to him going to this restaurant. He's friends with the owners, and he'll hear people out and, you know, see, you know, if he can help with their problems. And so, you know, there's a point at which he's kind of mobbed in there. I'd love to see the Virgin cover of this without the logo covering up the people, just so I could see everybody Mike Parovic drew. This is a awesome, awesome cover. But anyway, so he ends up helping someone who ends up actually being a crime boss whose daughter has run off with a low-level criminal he doesn't like. And this is a very different story from The River. This has more of the feel of Quentin Tarantino's stuff, except it's much more grounded and without his over-the-top sense of humor. But it has that kind of Pulp Fiction feel that focuses more on the seedy criminals. And it's just a really, really well-done story. Just very different from The River, but still a lot of fun. And so the fourth plot line has yet another shift in tone with these black drug dealers coming from out of town. And this is a much more action-oriented story, and it feels over the top and out of place for this particular series. And plus some of the dialogue, you know, in the black community just feels really off. These two issues, you know, aside from the absolutely amazing artwork, do feel a bit off for this series. But the book returns to form and then some in this wonderful standalone issue guest starring the Vigilante, except he doesn't look like this in the interior. It's a very different Vigilante. This is a Vigilante who's been retired for a while. He's now cashing in on his fame as an actor. And it's just a very interesting look at, you know, an old retired Vigilante and kind of how that reflects on El Diablo. And it's just a really wonderful, quirky story. I highly, highly recommend it. And the last plot line is amazing. This is The River, and it deals with illegal immigration and kind of goes back into that drama territory of a problem that's too big for a vigilante to solve. And it's just really, really powerful stuff that explores it from several different angles and is just really amazing. The ending's a little odd, but symbolically it's about, you know, that nobody has the answers for the problems presented here. And that's still true today. And on a practical level, you just have to remember he is a vigilante, so he cannot press charges or testify himself because, you know, can't reveal his identity and wears a mask. So he would have to have other people to do that for him. To bring someone in. Just keep that in mind when you're reading the ending. And so this is the final issue, and I love this cover. I love him taking off the mask, you know, with all those different covers from El Diablo in the background. This is not the final issue they wanted to do. They were canceled. But it is a good issue, and it wraps up this series in a way that is true to these characters and is satisfying. And so along with the 16-issue series, you should also pick up Secret Origins 45, which has a origin story by that same creative team. Definitely worth picking up. And so issue 16 was the last issue. It was canceled due to low sales. Originally, it was going to be canceled in issue 12, but they gave him some more issues to kind of wrap things up, which was great. Those final issues were fantastic. And they ran through some subplots, including one about somebody who's accused of being a reverse racist and stuff for teaching, you know, that slavery was bad and stuff like that. So it is really, honest to God, if I picked this up off the shelf today, I would have thought this entire series was written today. I would have thought that it came out in 2020, 2021. That's how relevant all of this stuff still is. And part of that is just how good the writing is, and part of that is just a sad reality that there's just a lot of problems we have in society that have not been fixed. So what was the final fate of El Diablo? That is actually a good question. So during Infinite Crisis, there was an Infinite Crisis special of Villains United. There was a prison break, and for whatever reason, they called up Rafael Sandova, who was now retired, just a city council member, to put on a mask and go fight a prison break for some reason with his bare hands. And if you've read Infinite Crisis, you probably know where this is going, because they put in a lot of old characters that weren't being used anymore, basically just to have them slaughtered. And sure enough, he gets shot during the prison break. Now, when I read that issue, I believed him to be dead. Wikipedia, however, says that he is not. He survived the gunshot wound. I will say that the scene is written ambiguously enough that either is possible. To me, he's probably dead unless someone wants to use the character. But it still leaves it open if someone did want to bring him back. You know, it's DC, and this has been a couple reboots ago, so I don't know if they would even have to address that scene anyway. So it was a really, really great series, and it just did something so different with the concept of the masked vigilante, and really breathed new life into the concept. I would have loved to have seen other comics do the same thing. I would have loved to have seen an entire line of similar characters who just dealt with real life stuff with no fantastic elements. You know, maybe not a universe, because I wouldn't necessarily want them to meet each other, because that might, you know, kind of undermine the whole point of the real world's setting, but just something, you know, along those same lines, because I think it's a very fertile and very different and interesting way to tell a superhero story. But unfortunately, it didn't catch on, and there's probably several reasons for that. I mean, obviously, it's a very different concept. You know, that kind of grounded storytelling was way ahead of its time. You know, I mean, readers at the time were probably being like, where's the supervillains? Where's your robots and cyborgs and aliens? Where's your Batman crossover? Where's your tie-ins? You know, none of that. And that made it kind of a hard sell. And also the artwork, I think, may have turned some people off. While I love Mike Parobic, obviously, a lot of people in the American audience very vocally hate anything with an animation influence. They look at something like this and they hate it and they think it's for kids. And I don't understand it, but unfortunately, that is a reality with some American comic fans. But of course, it would pave the way for both the artist and writer to go on and do bigger books. Of course, I've already shown you some of the work by the great Mike Parobic, who unfortunately had a tragically short life. He died in 1996 at the age of 30. And so he did not leave a very big body of work, but for the amount of time he was alive, it is a substantial amount, and it is very, very, very good. Jones would, of course, go on to do Green Lantern and all the spin-off series in the 90s. He would also do Wonder Man for Marvel and Prime for Ultraverse. And unfortunately, that brings me around to another tragedy of El Diablo and why it probably is not even available in print or digital. If you're a Green Lantern fan, you'll notice that there is a lot of Green Lantern stuff collected, but not Jones's run. It's this big hole that exists as far as the trade paperbacks and digital comics go. Same thing with his Wonder Man work. And the reason for that is in 2018, he was convicted of possession of child pornography. And so he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. And that seems to be why El Diablo and his Green Lantern run and Wonder Man are not available in trade or digital. While no one's excusing what he did, it was almost 20 years after he wrote those comics and has absolutely nothing to do with his work as a writer. And it certainly has nothing to do with El Diablo or Hal Jordan or the great artists who work on those series. It has nothing to do with Pat Broderick and M.D. Bright and Joe Staton, who put in great work on Green Lantern. It has nothing to do with the late Mike Parobic, who put in amazing work on his first ever series. And so I sort of don't get why that would make companies hesitant to reprint the stuff. Again, completely unrelated. And he's one person on a creative team that put out these comics. He was convicted by a court. He is being punished for his crime. He's serving 6 years, and no doubt after that he will be a registered sex offender for the rest of his life. So I don't get why his work has to be erased too. It just doesn't make any sense, because that isn't what I'm seeing with anyone else who's been convicted of a serious crime. For instance, Mike Tyson, convicted of rape. Mike Tyson continued to have a boxing career afterwards. He continued to have a television career afterwards. Bill Cosby, serial rapist, a convicted sexual predator. And I can still stream The Cosby Show. There was an actor who starred in 2 seasons of Power Rangers and then went on to kill his roommate, and he was convicted of that, and I can still stream both of those series just fine. So I don't know why this situation would be dealt with so differently. I mean, I think that, you know, if you can't separate the person from the work, that's fine. You don't need to buy it or read it. That's fine. You know, if something someone did umpteen years after they wrote something taints your ability to read that thing they wrote, that's okay. But that's a choice people should have. And, you know, obviously DC and Marvel have the right to reprint and put on digital anything they want to. And if they don't want to put it on there, they have that right. But I just feel like El Diablo really should be available for a new generation of readers to enjoy. If nothing else for Mike Parabik's artwork, but I certainly think the story still speaks to a lot of the things that we're dealing with today. So anyway, I do recommend hunting down the issues of El Diablo. You can hunt them down all on eBay. And, you know, again, it's not a perfect series. There's some bumps in the road, but my goodness, when it's good, it is so good. And it's certainly worth buying, especially if you're looking for a different take on the superhero and vigilante motifs. And, you know, while it's sad, you know, what happened to the creators, one died young and the other's in prison, it doesn't, to me, it does not detract from what they put out back then. And so that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.